I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and this is The Radical Center, a recording project I began in 2022 as a way to describe and discuss the social and ideological currents that are rapidly altering our culture. In a time when political polarization seems to be the norm, I'm seeking to understand rather than react. I'm grateful to all the thoughtful men and women who share their stories and insights with me in this conversation series. If you would like to contribute to this project financially, there are links in the description. Thank you, and thank you all for listening and being part of this exploration. All right, today I am speaking with Amy Farah Weiss. And Amy, you are the founder and director of St. Francis Challenge, which is a nonprofit that you launched in San Francisco in 2015. And it works to end street homelessness and build a movement of resident stewardship through the co-creation of best places, communities of belonging, essential needs, shared agreements, and teamwork. I am really interested in your experiences with this issue and just getting a better sense of what's going on in homelessness in general and what people who work in that area see as solutions or it's a problem that's just grown and grown over time. So I moved to Seattle in 2009, and there was some homelessness where I lived before, but not very much. It wasn't really something that I noticed. I lived in San Antonio, and I think it's gotten worse there too. But it was something I would see traveling to DC or bigger cities. But I really didn't see it very much in my hometown. And in 2009, it became, when I moved to Seattle, it was front and center. There was a lot of homelessness. There were, you'd see the same cast of characters. I remember this really nice guy that he was very friendly and very charming, and I'd always give him a couple bucks or something when I'd see him. And I saw him and I think his girlfriend just really deteriorate over a couple of years. And it was very sad to see this guy who'd gone from very vibrant and charming to increasingly haggard. And I don't know, in the throes of some addiction because sometimes he was definitely more impaired, but it was still kind of like you could see certain individuals that you'd see over and over again. And it seemed to really radically increase I'm not exactly sure what year. I'm just going to kind of go with 2015 or 2017, something like that. And I've told this story before, but it was probably 2017. I lived in the Green Lake area of Seattle, which is really, really pretty little old area, lovely, but increasingly subject to overcrowding. And I was pumping gas at a gas station, and this young man walked from the gas station towards my car. And I thought maybe he was the attendant. He was walking straight towards me. And I thought maybe he's going to tell me something about the pump or, I don't know, my card or something like that. He was a nice looking young man. And instead, he stopped right in front of me and bent over the trash can and started rifling through it. He found the end of an old Slim Jim or like beef stick, stuck it in his mouth, kept rifling through. And I realized this is a homeless guy. Like, this is one of these guys in these tents that are popping up everywhere. And from that point, we just started having stuff stolen off of our porch. And more, it was unavoidable, this idea. So, and I feel like it really ruined some parts of Seattle and maybe all of Seattle for me. It was part of why I needed to move. And I know San Francisco has been the subject of a lot of, I guess, attention for this issue. And as somebody who's been there, I'm going to stop talking and give you a space to share what your experiences have been.
Sure. Well, I started St. Francis Challenge in 2015. So we're actually celebrating our 10-year anniversary of doing this work. And I started, I'll go back and say that I lived in Portland, Oregon in 2001. and I did an AmeriCorps Vista position where I was working at a women's shelter. And so that was the first experience I had doing direct service work with people experiencing homelessness and exiting homelessness. And I had actually started an interest in that. I was doing an art project at the time. I was living in Portland, and I went downtown and I was doing an art project about Yoko Ono. So I was actually asking people on the street what they thought of these interactive art projects that she did. And I went up to this man, and he turned up to be unhoused. And we had this really big conversation. And that was the first time in Portland that I had engaged with someone who had been experiencing homeless. But I had come from the Bay Area where I grew up. And when I would go to San Francisco, when you would go to the Tenderloin, you would see a lot of people out and about on the street. And I remember thinking at that time, gosh, I'd have to have a force field around my heart to live in San Francisco every day, because this need is right there out in the open. And then to your point, even back from, the late 90s, early 2000s, it wasn't as bad as it got later on in 2015. And I think that what happened in San Francisco, part of it was a building boom that happened. And so all of the places where people could hide in the margins started shrinking. So the margins came into the center, and you couldn't help but see, because before, where it was out in the outskirts in Soma or Mission Bay, where there was no development, all of a sudden there were people there. Another big thing that happened in 2015, I believe it was, or maybe it was 2017, was something called Martin versus Boise, which was a court decision which said that in Boise, Idaho, they were trying to displace someone who was on the street, who didn't have a place to go, who was homeless. And the idea was from the courts that you couldn't displace people and criminalize homelessness unless people had a place where they could go. And so that went from going from the one-on-one, hey, we're going to go do an encampment site. Sometimes they call them sweeps, where they'll go to a site, and the police and outreach workers will go and try to clean up a site. And there was more of a one-on-one approach where you had so many beds that were available, and you would say, okay, well, we have 10 beds available. There are 10 people here. We offered everybody here shelter so we can ask them to leave.
Mm-hmm.
But then it became to be construed that unless you had enough shelter for everybody who was experiencing homelessness in your town, when someone rejected shelter, you couldn't criminalize that.
Mm-hmm.
And my perspective is that we need to have a lot more options available to people, and we are a very wealthy country. And so we should be able to invest in all of the supports and structures and create all the different options that we need so that we don't have to criminalize people. So I'm in this middle that people need a place to belong. And that's where we're coming from, is that everybody deserves a place to belong. But we also believe that everyone should be a team player and everybody should consider their impact. So I don't find myself on a side when it comes to politics on this issue, because I'm in the radical center with you, where we're seeing, okay, the left is actually saying, leave this alone. Don't look over here. There's not a problem. These are just unhoused people living their lives. Leave it be, and create housing for people, and that will be the solution. And it's not that simple. I agree with parts of that, but it's not that simple. And then on the right, it's, why don't these people just get a job? Why don't we get them out of sight? We don't really want to deal with it. And so I'm looking for ways where we can take best practices and what we're learning about what works and invest in that, rather than what we're doing, which doesn't seem to be working at all, with both sides fighting each other and not accepting that individuals need to take accountability, and so do the structures and the systems. That was
Yeah.
really all over the place, but
No, that's
that's an
great.
intro.
I don't know that I have a side on this one either, and I'm not sure if I have a clear definition of what the sides even are on this topic, but I have felt my empathy decrease significantly over time towards people, towards homeless people. I noticed that you use kind of the polite language, and that's interesting too. I think we have there's so much we have to be so careful sometimes with language that dehumanizes people, but I don't necessarily feel like saying homeless people is dehumanizing. So I'll go ahead and keep using that. Although,
I agree with you. I don't think the word homeless is dehumanizing.
yeah, it's just a descriptor. But I know as words become the norm, we tend to creep towards more and more euphemistic language with everything. But I remember I was telling you about the guy that I felt bad for him and I wanted to help him out, and I would see that same guy. And I used to, when I moved to Seattle, I'd carry a couple of ones and I'd often give a couple dollars to the people on the street if I was at a stop and there was a guy panhandling. Now I almost feel anger towards drivers when I see them do that. So my empathy has gone down tremendously since as this issue has gone up. When I lived in Monroe, Washington. That was one of the kind of a stopping point. Now I'm in Spokane. So I went from Seattle. I lived in Monroe. Monroe's a little town. It's not very big. It's a very pretty little town, and we'd have open drug deals just going down at the park down the street. So you felt like you couldn't send your kids on bike rides around because there's people sitting there doing drugs, laying on the benches, selling their stuff. You'd have, we lived across from an old school building that was not in regular use. It was just like a district office. Sometimes they do trainings there, but a lot of the time it was just empty. It was a pretty old building. And you'd have homeless people just come and sit out on the lawn with their drugs across from my house. They would steal things off the porches. I had things, I'd kick off my shoes and then they'd be gone the next day. They would come into my yard through my gate and up to the porch, steal packages. I had a little wagon that I left out for an afternoon that I would take to the beach with my kids. The wagon was gone. Then, left it out for a couple hours and it was gone. So stuff, the theft, the drugs, all of this. And I'd had my car broken into several times living in Seattle and living in Monroe. They tried to break in through the keyhole one time and messed up my car. And when I would call the police were really sympathetic to my complaints and would often come out and move people along if they were on that lawn right across the street. But you'd have guys walking shirtless and screaming things at people just in like a residential neighborhood, just because I don't know, they didn't have anything better to do. They were unproductive and looking for stimulation. I don't know I don't want to attribute motivations necessarily, but I was told by the police that in Washington state, the governor decriminalized a lot of formerly petty crimes like drug deals and public intoxication was decriminalized. I don't know, but I'm imagining panhandling has been decriminalized because it's so very prevalent. And I would like to see something done to protect citizens from that particular criminal engagement that's becoming such a normal part of life now. I feel bad for people who are in a hard place. And I think that there's some truth that a lot of working class people are closer to that situation than they may like to think that they are. I mean, everything's gotten so expensive and housing prices are crazy. So I can see that there would be a giant leap if you have fallen into that situation through poverty or addiction or whatever situation, hardship has fallen into your life, that once you're there, it might be very, very hard to climb back out of it. So I don't really have a sense of a side either, but I'm frustrated that it seems to be more and more people are falling into that pit. And then there's this burden we're just kind of expanding what is allowed for people
Mhm.
to get away with on the fringes of society rather than working on constructive solutions to prevent people from falling there or to help
Mhm.
people hold them accountable so that they can
Mhm.
access a better life, but also give them the tools to do that. So, um,
Right.
and I think that the like public camping thing is a really weird. It's a really weird thing that's happened. I know I can speak to Seattle quite a bit, but there were beautiful parks there that
Mhm.
started to have tents all over them. And we already have a hard time getting our kids to go outside and play these days with everybody being trapped on screens. If
Mhm.
you feel like outside is one of my big impediments to sending my kids off, and now they're 12 and 14, I do let them go off. They like to ride their bikes for hours at a time, so I'll let them go out and do that. But one of the things I worry about, in addition to traffic and cars and whatnot, is these dangerous and often drugged out people who I don't know what element of chaos that adds to the situation. And it worries me for my kids to ride their bikes through crowds of, you know, disorderly folk.
Well, the good news is that most people who are in that situation aren't trying to draw attention to themselves or be impactful on society in a negative way. Uh, but there is a percentage of people that are. And so
Mhm.
what happened with me back in 2015 when I started St. Francis Challenge, and I had actually run for mayor of San Francisco in 2015, 2014 and 2015. And that was one of the issues that most captivated me, along with how do we support positive development? Because there was a lot of NIMBYism and
What does that
issues around
mean,
not
NIMBYism?
in my backyard. And
Okay.
that's not in my backyard for building more housing. And that's also not in my backyard for shelters and solutions to homelessness. So, not in my backyard, uh, Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, that whole idea of environmentalism, like people
Mhm.
didn't want the power plant in their backyard, but they want the
Mhm.
power to come from somewhere.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
so that idea of NIMBYism, I actually countered back in 2012. I started a organization, a nonprofit called Neighbors Developing Divisadero, because I saw myself as being a very progressive person. I aligned in that way. And I felt that the progressives were understandably upset after the global financial collapse, and a lot of low income artist type people were being pushed out because there was a second uh, .com boom, so to speak. There had been one in the 90s in San Francisco, and a lot of people had been pushed out then. And then we had put on all these laws and policies in place to protect against that happening again. But then all of those got eroded in a 10-year period. And then when the second, boom happened after the global financial collapse, it just felt like, why aren't we learning from the past?
Mhm.
Why aren't we figuring out how to safeguard people in neighborhoods? So the idea of building more housing and having it be market rate housing was something progressives really pushed against. But I thought, well, we can't just be a party of no. We have to say yes to something, and there has to be inclusive, sustainable, culturally enriching development we could get behind. And so one of the things that I found during that work is that people didn't mind if buildings were higher if they had a more inclusionary rate of low income tenants. And so it wasn't that people were opposed to building, because I would show a building, when I was running for mayor, I would show a building and say, what do you think of this? And oh, look at this terrible architecture. Or, this is just so uninspiring. Or look at the height. And then I'd say, this is 100% affordable.
Mhm.
And then their whole demeanor would change. Oh, well, this is great housing. So you can see a lot of this stuff is coming from emotion and this pushback against being pushed out, but there weren't solutions that were coming out of it. And the same thing was happening with homelessness, with street homelessness. And after I ran for mayor, we had actually used ranked choice voting with a few other candidates. And so we got 35% of the vote together with almost no money, and I had put forward these policies, and I didn't come from any background where I could support a new type of development. So I thought, well, one thing I know I can do with my background, I have a sociology major, I have a master's in organizational development. I've done, like 2 decades of doing work, service work and policy work. And so I decided I'm going to start an organization and we're going to deal with the unsheltered homelessness crisis. And at that time, there still is an organization that's more of the radical lefty coalition on homelessness in San Francisco. And I hadn't done too much of a deep dive into the issues, connecting development and homelessness. But there was this push towards, if we only created enough housing for people who are on the streets, then we'll solve the problem. I remember going to a meeting in 2016, and there was this discussion about, this is how much it would cost. This is how many people are on the street. This is how much it would cost to get people into housing. So it's just a money issue. And it turns out that that's not the case. It's super complicated because we do have people coming from all over the country, and having that freedom of movement. But then when you're working on the streets of San Francisco and you see that there are people who have been homeless there for over a decade that are from San Francisco, and then you meet someone outside of the library who just moved here from Chicago, he was homeless when he got to San Francisco, and now he has housing. And there's some sense of everybody that thinks, well, that's not quite right either. Like, how did this person who just came here get housing? Of course, when you talk to that individual person and you see their gratitude for being housed and the struggles that they've been through, you can look at each individual and think, I'm really happy for you that you got this opportunity. But then how do we make this fair for everyone? So if you're going to be a city that's trying to actually end unsheltered homelessness, you have to take into account that freedom of movement and think about, well, what is our responsibility to people who became homeless here or people who are coming here being homeless already? So that's part of it. Another thing that really stood out to me was that the Coalition on Homelessness was really pushing this idea of, don't complain about people who are on the street, don't complain about homeless people because that's a class issue. And that's when that whole oppressor-oppressed narrative really came forward to me, where I saw that people were just stuck in that mindset where they were thinking homeless person good because they're oppressed and because they're marginalized, people who are neighbors complaining about homeless person bad because they're privileged. But what happens when you're at like one of the groups that I worked with was I worked with large encampments. That was the work of St. Francis Challenge, where there are over 3,500 people on the street, and there were large encampments at that time. It's changed since then, but in 2015 to 2020, like there were just large encampments everywhere of over 30 people. So the way that I actually got started working with this, my first encampment, I had done some overnights because at the time, the mayor, Ed Lee, one of the things I had run on for running for mayor is that the Super Bowl, the 50th anniversary of the Super Bowl, was coming up in 2016. And so Ed Lee was talking about how he was going to focus on that celebration. We had so many people on the street, and he was going to move everyone from the Embarcadero over to this other part of town to be under the freeway in tents. And that's not a solution. And that's really tone deaf when we're having these issues, to have a celebration rather than figure out how are we going to deal with this situation.
Well, it's quite literally sweeping things under the rug or putting
Correct.
all your mess in the closet.
Correct. So I started doing some overnights with porta potties because people didn't have a place to go to the bathroom. Just trying to figure out how to work with people on the street. So I led about 30 volunteers, went out and we did interviews with people who were living on the street and asked them, would you be interested in cabin villages? Because that was something that I started promoting in 2015 when I ran for mayor, is that we should have these places of transitional shelter with tiny homes, cabins, etc., to support people. And everybody that we talked to was interested in that on the street, but we were being told by the radical homelessness group that people didn't want that, that they wanted housing, and that what
Mm.
we were doing was putting a band-aid on something. But I felt, and so did the people on the street, and so did so many people and yourself, that it's not a distraction to end street homelessness with an interim solution that isn't permanent housing,
Mhm.
because every day that people are on the street, they become more, in that mindset, and dealing with more crisis, more trauma that's just normalized. So I started working with this particular group because a police officer heard that I'd been bringing out porta potties. A police officer in San Francisco, like, how wonderful. She cared about these people she was working with on the street. They called it Box City because a lot of people had made their own little cabins, and it was right by the Caltrain. So it was right by really noisy area and an industrial area. But I heard from this police officer that, oh, there's a gentleman there that has requested a porta potty. And so I actually rode my bike out there that night at 10 o'clock, and said, hi, I heard that there's an interest in having a porta potty here. And so I started working with these 30 people who were at this site. We brought out the porta potty. The San Francisco Chronicle was there, and so was the police officer. And it's like, how is it news that people are going to have a place to go to the bathroom? But that's where we're at, in 2016. And I started working with the people at that site on being good neighbors and figuring out how, okay, I'm trying to understand how the Department of Public Works and the Department of Public Health and SFPD interact with this particular site. And there was so much disorganization and people working against each other. But I was able to work with one of the frontline supervisors for the on the ground DPW, Department of Public Works, that would go and clean up the site. So we could actually say, why don't you come on these 2 days and we'll be ready for you, so that you don't have to work against us. And so just those simple things of trying to bring people together. And it was also, I would look at the 311 reports for that encampment, because for San Francisco, you can call in and make a complaint about something. And so there'd be this data that was fresh, that was coming in every day. And so I could look and see, oh, the person in this condo complained about this shelter last night, saying somebody's banging something at 3 a.m. So then I would go there the next day and I would say, hey guys, we got a complaint last night. Someone's banging metal at 3 a.m. Oh, that's Johnny. He's doing some like, oh, Johnny, do you think you could wait to do that till the trains start up again, in the morning? And he would work with me. So it was just this way of me being an intermediary between the encampment, the neighbors, and volunteers and public officials and different departments. And one of the things that didn't ring right to me, like I said, with the more radical homelessness group, is they were not admitting that the people in the condo that weren't able to go to sleep at night, that were paying $3,000 for their condo, uh, were mattered just as much as the people on the street. It was
Mhm.
almost that the people on the street mattered more.
Mhm.
And I don't think that's true. I think everybody's needs matter. And so I remember being on a phone call with that group, and they were saying, oh, these racist people saying that, they're complaining about it. I said, well, that's not true, because the guy that I just met with who lives in this condo is an African American who worked really hard to get this condo. And now he's looking out and seeing folks that are not following any kind of societal contract about how to work together, are being able to be there and he doesn't have any kind of say. I don't think that's right. I think everybody's needs matter. And the other thing that didn't ring true was that people were being, that idea of the marginalized lifting up to, I realized, oh my gosh, I've been doing direct service work since I was like 18, really. I've been called to do that kind of work. And I went through a lot of like existential depression for like 2 decades. And the only thing that I knew for certain was good was being of service.
Mm.
Like during all that time, whenever I would be in that role, not that it wasn't hard at times, but I just knew it was important. And so I'm a service person. And one of the things I used to always put on my resumes and mission statements, to empower the marginalized. And I thought we were all trying to empower each other so that we could all thrive. I thought the end goal was that we were empowering everybody so that we could thrive. It turns out that there were a lot of people on the left that were actually saying, let's empower the marginalized so we can invert the power dynamic.
Yeah,
and
that's the logical conclusion. Yeah.
In control. I was so naive. I thought I was coming from an MLK foundation of, I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian upbringing. I left the church at 16, but it stuck with me, the good parts about, heaven is inside us all, do good works, and that's how you become a spiritual person and connect with source. Those were the things that were really important to me. But I was seeing this inversion where bullies were being lifted up because there were bullies within the unsheltered community, just like any other community. And I was seeing some of the people being lifted up as the spokespeople who were some of the biggest bullies in that community. And then I was seeing that we were supposed to leave the people on the street alone, but about 10 to 15% of the people on the street are terrorizing the 85 to 90% of people on the street. Most people on the street aren't causing problems. They're trying to keep to themselves and survive. But I worked with 4 different very large encampments. And there was one where there was this absolute bully who was in charge. And he ended up taking one of the cabins we had given to a vulnerable woman. And I remember he had a stack of hundreds and he had a weapon in his cabin. And, I still connected with him and I still think he's a precious child of God who's very confused and acting out in ways that are very rascally and self-serving rather. Everybody on the street to like most people on the street, I'll say are rascals. I'll say that. I'm a rascal. That's why I get along so well in this world of people, because the rascal part of me and the rascal part of them is that we push edges and we like our freedoms and we like to be our own individual selves. But there's 2 different kind of rascals on the street is how I look at it, or in life, is that there's the rascals that are team players that are, trying to live their life in, alignment with greater principles of being a team player. And then there's rascals that are self-serving. And so what I try to do, in my work, when I started doing this work at Box City back in 2016 and 17, I was going out there and I could figure out the people who were the rascals for good and the rascals who were just self-serving. And some of the community in that place of Box City and just in general is some of the most beautiful community you've ever seen in your life. People taking care of each other who have nothing. And there were certain leaders at Box City, this applies to every encampment I worked with, who would look out for others. And so there'd be someone there who was in extreme mental distress. I could tell you her whole story. It would make you cry. And she was having a challenge out there. And these guys that are out there just trying to survive, let her get help first. Let her get help. Like they knew who needed help. They were willing to sacrifice themselves. And then there were people who were uh, really making it worse for everyone because they wouldn't follow along with any kind of support. One thing that happened at Box City was there was a person that came there and she was lauded as this hero by the lefty groups and the people that were working for the city's Department of Public Health who were just giving out needles at this time. There was this one encampment that I was working with, and this woman there was literally breeding rats in her tent. She had a fentanyl addiction. She, was a very nice person. I really care for her, but she should not be the person that the Department of Public Health went and gave 30 boxes of needles to so she could distribute them to everyone to save people. That doesn't make sense either. That's where we keep coming across these slippery slopes of, oh, well, if we don't do this, then we're going to have to pay for it in the end because there's the issue is going to get worse. But then we start enabling it and it gets worse. And so I feel like our generation here is like testing out all these theories about how much do you allow, how much do you hold people accountable? And we're just in this, great rebalancing time of people being given freedoms and being left alone. And, oh, well, that doesn't work either. And, I'll say one more story about the drug issue is that there was this one person who came to Box City later than, because I had been working with everyone and I was doing case management really, in this de facto way with each person there, and a new person came. And later on, I was told by some of the people from the Department of Public Health how great this particular person was because they had used Narcan to save the lives of a couple people. And I said, well, that's the same person who brought in the fentanyl.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that person's really challenging to deal with. And so you're lifting that person up as a hero because they're saving lives, but they were the reason why the person was put in jeopardy in the first place. And so I just kept coming up against all of these really well-meaning, well-intentioned approaches, and they don't work. But I remember, if you go back far enough and we didn't think that, like, we thought, oh, well, just give people a chance to implement services in a way that is dignified, and we give people these opportunities to work together. Just give us the chance, give us the funding to do it. But now that there's been funding and there's been some chances, like, in Oregon, they decriminalized drugs and then they had to rebalance from that experiment. We're seeing that it's not just the big bad conservatives that are the problem with the situation, because it's not just about money and funding. It is about accountability. We have to have these mixes of accountability, like I said, for the structure and for the individual. And so I guess I'll wrap up with this stream of consciousness here by saying that when I was working with Box City, I started up a resident steward program. And because I was putting the porta potty out there, and if the porta potty got destroyed, then my organization, we would be on the hook for, a couple $1,000s to replace it. And I wanted it to be maintained. And so we started working with the individuals there. If you maintain the porta potty, then you get incentives. And that's what really started that Resident Steward project. And I had also worked back in my 20s, I had worked at this place in Massachusetts called Gould Farm. Have you heard of that?
Mm-mm.
It's a place, it's in the Berkshires, and it started up as a respite for people with extreme mental health issues. And then it became more institutionalized at a certain point. And when I got there, it was 2003. and there are 150 people living there. 40 people were guests coming out of a psychiatric hospital. And this was this interim place where you could live in community. Work was part of healing, and being in community was part of healing. And so everybody did 20 hours of work a week. And I saw that the benefits of it, I saw the challenges of it, because every implementation of any program that involves human beings co-living is challenging.
Mm-hmm.
That's just the reality, whether it's an HOA or an encampment or a residential program. It's always an experiment with the people living there trying to make it work. But I did see the value of people being members of a community. So you could work in forestry and grounds, you could work in the kitchen, you could work in cleanup crew. And there was one person there, he had a schizophrenia diagnosis and he was blind and he was really ornery. I worked in the kitchen most of the day, and I would walk by him sometimes and he'd always say, like, "What's your problem, Amy? What's your problem?" And then one day I went up to him and was like, "You know what my problem is, Mike? You're so great." And then he started laughing and I had him in the palm of my hands from that point on. But they found a job for this guy. Mike found a job being able to answer the phones. He did it laying on the ground, and he'd pick, because this was just, this place out in the middle of the Berkshires, but when people would call, it was Mike that would answer the phone, laying on the ground. And I just mentioned that because here's a person who you would think would how do you find a job for Mike to do? But Mike found a job to do, and that gave his life meaning. And he was part of the operations of the place. And so that whole concept of resident stewardship, and not just saying we're going to create this place for you to live and give you everything in order to solve your problems. It's let's do this together. You need a place to live. Great. Let's help you to be a good neighbor and contribute to where you live. So that's the concept of resident stewardship that I've been working on since that Box City experience.
I have so many thoughts and questions for you based on what you're saying. And first of all, I just want to compliment you on your compassion and your positivity with regard to this, and your humanizing people in this situation. And I'm so aware as you're speaking of a resistance in myself to feeling that, because I've become very intolerant of it. And so I'm kind of just noticing this contrast, and I'm appreciating the way that you're speaking about this. And I'm just so aware of my own resistance here. So many thoughts. Like as a homeowner, taxpayer, a business owner, and a mother, I have and maybe this is just me growing more conservative over time, which part of it is that anchoring in community and that contribution, that tax-paying contribution. I want to know, I don't think that anybody's entitled to public funds in this particular way. Like I'm trying to articulate something that like old school conservatives are probably like, duh, but I am coming to this myself as I'm growing through life. I see an entitlement here. Like we have to pay for people who made choices when everybody else is working really hard. This is like my brother had this reaction when there was a proposal for a student loan forgiveness. And I have student loans. I have a lot of student loan debt that I'm going to be working through for a long time. He worked really hard to pay all of his loans off. And he sacrificed a lot to be able to do that, and lived very tightly in order to pay that back in full on a short time scale for himself on several years. But excuse me, lingering cough. He was really upset when he saw that there was a proposal for forgiveness of other people. And I can make lots of excuses about why people should be forgiven for their student loan debt, why it's a toxic debt load, why it is irresponsible for our government and our universities to have put people in that position to have so much debt that hangs over them. And I could make that case, and I agree with a lot of that. And yet I also see somebody like that saying, I worked my ass off and I sacrificed really hard to do that. And it would really bother me to see somebody else just get a handout. And as, somebody who's been a single mother, who's been in a domestic violence situation, who's had lots of trouble and lived a lot of life under the poverty line. Like I went years where I could have afforded food. I qualified for food stamps, for instance, for TANF, the temporary aid for needy families, and Medicaid, and I didn't take it because I thought that is not in my ethics to do that. So I'll work and I'll do with what I've got. I just have there's that part of me that says, why should other people be entitled to the work that people who have not privileged people, not wealthy people who've never had to think about it, but the money and the work product of people who have actually struggled but haven't given in to hopelessness in that particular way, or rejected the system in that particular way. So there's that part of it. And then there's the the NIMBY thing is interesting too. And I can sympathize with the not in my backyard idea. When I look at places that have services for the homeless in Spokane, in Seattle, in cities that I've lived in, and you see throngs of people outside crowding the sidewalks, making it hard for other people to walk through, harassing passersby, creating a really trashy, like literally trashy environment there with trash all over the ground in front of it for blocks around the places that host services. So if it were a tidy thing where you actually make regulations about where people can be, there's this part of it that, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to articulate this really well, and thank you for letting me get all this out. And I really appreciate the contrast between our positions. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on what I'm saying. I interviewed, I've had a couple of discussions around the idea of PDA in children. I don't know if you know anything about this, but it's this idea that some children have a pathological demand avoidance that makes them uniquely unable to be a disciplined kid. So that, you can't, this is the idea that you cannot put any demands on this child because they have a special problem that makes them somebody who can't be told not to throw things at people or hit people, cannot be told to put down their iPad or turn off the TV. So basically, this is a carve out for this special type of child where no discipline can be imposed on them. And it's a self-report by the parent that this is what my kid is. I do think that there are some temperaments that are just more difficult to work with. I absolutely agree with that. But I have a hard time with accepting that, as the PDA rhetoric would tell you, that there's this nervous system disability, which cannot be detected by any kind of testing. It's just it's self-report on the basis of the parent. That there's this child has a special disability, which means that we can never expect them to become a part of an orderly household. We have to constantly provide them with everything that they want, whenever they want it, and not expect them to do things that we would expect their siblings to do, or other children and other families to do. And I feel like there's an element of that in the way that I hear a lot of the approaches to homelessness. Like, oh, this is a special kind of person who we have to just accept that they can't do what anybody else can do. So we have to just give in to all of their demands. We have to give them their needles, allow them to do drugs, allow them to harass people, allow them to be disorderly in public, half naked in public, and things that we wouldn't allow for the average citizen to do. But here there's a special carve out, so we tolerate it. So we've almost got like this PDA kind of carve out for a class of citizens, adults. And I wonder, What, and maybe there's something wrong with this. So I'm actually asking, it's not just rhetorical. What would be wrong with just tightening up the public decency laws again, making it a crime to panhandle, making it a crime to do drugs in the open, making public intoxication criminal, and loitering criminal, and providing enough shelter on a minimum basis that basically says you have a space you can go to if you're in such dire straits that you are going to be sleeping rough on the streets as an alternative, or you'd be loitering. So we have a place for you. It's not real cushy, it's not real cozy, but we're going to keep it safe and warm. And then everything else is up to you. And if you fall through the cracks of that and you're out there committing crimes, even if they're petty crimes, you will be held accountable for it. So what would be wrong with taking that kind of approach? A kind of a
I
minimalist
think we're in
approach.
that zone, like I said, of a rebalancing, because there was this idea of what if we did it this way? What if we, what if, yeah, what if we allowed for this to happen without cracking down on it because there's not enough supports? What if we allowed that to happen? And is what's happening out on the streets right now better or safer? Do people feel like it's good for anyone? I don't think most people can say yes to that. So this is all an experiment.
Mm-hmm.
I guess look at it that way, is that I keep seeing like, oh, well, let's go a little bit far this way or a little bit far this way. Let's enable things. Let's make people more accountable. I guess so I just see this toggling back and forth. And I look back at my little, 22-year-old Ames and think about myself back then. And, I just graduated from UC Santa Cruz. And I really believed that if we were able to make the accounting case through metrics, that we could show that prevention is actually a better investment than dealing with things downstream from issues. And then I saw people on both the left and right not use data when they're making their decisions or cover up data. So I feel like a lot of this is just emotional, and people are like, shooting from the hip about how do we deal with this.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that's super important to me, because you talked about the empathy piece, and I just want to address this first, is that the values of St. Francis Challenge, the resident steward values, and I've been tinkering with those. I have 10 values that we've had from the beginning, but they've shifted a little bit as I've done the work. And I think that's really important for everyone right now to, I'd give everyone who's watching this the homework of over the next week, come up with 10 values that you live by, your own 10 values, and really put some thought into it and be accountable to those values. So the first value of the resident steward values is you belong. And that's something I think we should all be connecting with more on a daily basis, is that feeling this sense of belonging. I didn't feel it till probably in my 40s, or like 30s, when I was working through some stuff. So I think that idea of like really feeling like you belong is something that we should pay more attention to, and that contributed to my depression for so many years. And the idea is that you belong, Leslie. You belong unequivocally to, you're in your body, you're in the human race, you're on the earth, you're in the cosmos. You belong in all these unequivocal ways, no matter where you end up. If you're on the street, you don't have a place to be tonight, or if you don't have anybody in your life that will vouch for you or that you can connect with, you belong in this really, really, really deep way. And so do 8 billion people on the planet. Wow, that's a lot to take in. Like, each person is a child of this universe. And James Baldwin has a great quote about, we really need to be thinking about like every kid is our own, and I think whenever I deal with a really challenging person in any capacity, the way that I get back to seeing that they belong is I think about them, you know, as an individual. I can love them as being an individual on this planet and being part of this experience. I don't have to like them. I don't have to like someone. And just because someone belongs doesn't mean they belong near your house or in your apartment complex or at a supported housing site or at a shelter, because they might be too harmful to be there. And so all these values that St. Francis Challenge has, they apply to the person who's on the margins and being challenged, but they also apply to us, because one of them is stand up for truth, safety, and well-being for everyone. Yes, everyone. And that includes you. That includes the neighbor of the encampment that can't sleep at night. Like, everybody's well-being matters. And so that's, I think, what happens to make this lopsided is that people will say, well, there's certain people that belong, or I love certain neighbors, but like I'm trying to make it this expansive thing where we get back to the root of like, we're all individuals here on this spinning planet, going through space, not really understanding how we got here or where we go at the end. So I feel like that humility and curiosity of why we're here is very important. And then also that sense of everybody belongs, but they might not belong here. And so that brings me to my second point, is that does everybody deserve to get support? Because that's kind of what you're talking about. It's like, do these folks deserve
what does
it?
anybody
It's almost
deserve?
like they're being entitled. And so I think about it this way. I last year I lived in and managed a sanctioned tent encampment in the city of Ojai, California, and there were up to 40 people living there when I got there. And there are people there that don't necessarily deserve the support because, like I said, they're rascals doing rascally things, kind of got into their, into their path in life where they're not taking accountability. Maybe they're doing harm even. The people that I think deserved it, the support, are the people who are accountable and team players. That's how I break it down. Like the people who deserve it here are the people who are accountable. They'll own the fact that their decisions were part of why they got there, and their decisions are part of how they will find their way out. And they're taking accountability and they'll pitch in. There's a lot of people there that, yeah. Let me just finish that one thought.
Yeah, okay.
So there are a lot of people there that aren't team players and they aren't being accountable, but they need support. So our goal in society is that there are people that we might think are deserving or not deserving of support, but that's irrelevant because there's a certain group of people that require that structure. So my thought is that we create enough places that have enough levels of freedom and autonomy to match the needs and the challenges of people so that we have enough supported, funded places for people to be that are structured. It's not whether they deserve it or not. It's just that it's necessary. So we have to create that structure. And when I think about creating those structures, I really want to focus on any place that we create should be a place that you or I would want to live.
I guess I think about that need, and like there might be somebody outside my house right now who really needs something, but I don't have to give that to them.
No.
And I see this differently when it comes to taxpayer funded things. It's me giving it, or it's you giving it. It's a forcible. It's by the force of a weapon. Basically, the government is a loaded gun, saying you take that out of your pocket and you give it to that person. And I really prefer a charity model, which is based on people who want to give and feel like they have the ability to give. And when it comes to deserve, that's a really tricky one for me, because I think there may be someone out there who's really, really, really struggling, but do they deserve to open my purse and pull out my money and, whatever I've worked for in order to do that? And I think that I don't know what the solution is for that, but I find that to be a really tricky one right there. Like encouraging philanthropy and encouraging giving, charitable giving, putting this back in that model rather than an entitlement program.
Mm.
I'm starting to really struggle with that over
Well,
time.
I think if the money was spent and we were getting the results that we wanted, I think you might think differently. Like if we
Maybe,
were in
maybe,
a,
but I mean, I would defund
yeah.
the public schools at this point. So I don't know.
Mm.
I'm kind of radically pulling back on what I think that public funding should look like in general. And this is one of those areas. And I'm really curious about, in your experience working with the homeless population, how, because I've started to see it as a subculture. And I don't know if I'm right in that. So I want to hear your thoughts. It kind of started with that young man, this really nice looking young man, fairly well dressed. I mean, enough that I thought he was the gas station attendant who was, when he got up really close and I saw him eating out of a trash can and I got a better look at him, he was intoxicated and I almost certainly belonged to that encampment that was just down the street, a bunch of tents that had just gone up not too long before. And I think about that, kind of rascal element that you're talking about, which I'm sort of contextually taking to mean like a defiant and free-spirited attitude. Kind of don't tell me what to do, kind of. And I can relate to that. I'm very much like that in a lot of ways myself. But the freedom of movement, I think, is very appealing. And I also see a lot less purpose being obviously available in society. I can see how the idea of anomie and that normlessness and that loss of a sense of ability to attain a purposeful life is a big part of our world right now as it's changed over the last couple of decades.
Mhm.
And so I can see that there'd be a certain, I guess, a certain element of us, a certain percentage of people who would be more affected by that. Maybe they just didn't feel like they saw anything that they aspired to. They weren't ever able to tap into a sense of meaning and passion or agency in their life. And I think that's horrible. And I think that for people like that, one way to escape some of the pressures might be drug and alcohol use and a culture that allows them to be free to move and do as they wish, and that there might be sort of even an outlaw element in that. Like I don't have to care about all these stupid rules for this stupid culture that's letting everybody down. And I mean, there's so many reasons to feel that way.
Mhm.
And and so I see this as kind of a, a subculture, and I think that and this is my vantage from the outside. You would know so much more about what this is actually like. So I'm just giving my perspective, and I see it as being a varied population of people who some people are generally or genuinely really, really hard luck stories, really like horrible, sad stuff. And then another portion of people being more of that opt-in subculture who maybe after a while become a hard luck story, but have some element of choice in adopting that lifestyle. And I'd like to understand better what percentage is what. And I think that as anytime, like say I adopt this PDA attitude for my older son and I say, well, I can't discipline him. I can't expect him to unload the dishwasher or do any chores because every time I tell him to do something, he just completely becomes unhinged. And then we spend the rest of the day dealing with his outbursts. Well, his brother has a really big incentive to do that too. Now, what's his brother, So
Mhm.
I think that as you have this sort of, well, you deserve it and you deserve it and you need it and you can get away with it. And you're a carve out because you're such a hard luck case. So we're not going to expect you to do the things that everybody else would do. And we'll give you your lunch and your breakfast and your dinner and a shelter, and we'll let you do drugs all you want. And if you want to panhandle, that's fine because you're a genuinely hard luck story. Well, that opens up an incentive for other people to say that, there's that safety net for me too. Maybe it's not that they're deliberately exploiting it, but that's how human psychology works, is that I'm going to see that now as some kind of an option. There's a bit of a safety net there, like a
I hear what you're saying.
fallback. Do you know what I mean?
I
Okay,
do.
so I'm wondering, and again, I'm totally aware as I'm speaking to you of your beautiful and empathetic stance, and I appreciate it. And I know that I'm sounding kind of like a hard ass, but I'm not ready to give up my hard ass attitude on this, but I'm wanting to see what's really happening and what your perspective is on this.
Yeah. And I think the solution is really a mix of what we're talking about. And I'm big on accountability and I'm big on structure. And it sounds like that's what you're hoping for too, is we create a structure that has so many options for people to plug into that we're hoping that they quote unquote take advantage of this option. Because right now,
Or that
when
they
it comes
carve out
to
their own, and that maybe it's not anybody else's responsibility to create that structure. Maybe there are things that are tremendously wrong with our culture right now. Like the inflation, the cost of everything is ridiculous because the government has printed out so much money. Though the way people's lives were upended by lockdowns was insane. And I can only imagine the social fallout that we're going to continue to see for the next period of our lives. Student loans is another one. The exploitation of young people by universities and banks is crazy. The corporatization of our prison system, which just turns these places into holding camps that breed more criminality rather than rehabilitation centers that put people back on the street as a better citizen than they went in. There's so many problems, and I'm more in favor, I suppose, of addressing those problems rather than creating new options. It just feels like we're adding layers of complexity and putting band-aids on things rather than getting into what's really wrong at the core of all of this. So,
yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I really feel like an option hasn't been created for Americans that needs to be there right now. And I'm talking about for all Americans. There should be a resident stewardship option of life where you're saying, you know what, I don't want to be completely dependent on the government because I don't have a disability. I have the ability to contribute. I don't want to be completely independent. What if there was an option for all Americans where you got to choose a resident stewardship lifestyle? And it didn't have to be your whole life, but it could start off with, being connected with college where you'd go off and do, a 1 or 2 years of a resident stewardship program, working on a farm. I did that in my 20s. I think everyone should work on a farm for a season just to understand what it means to produce food for other people and be part of nature in that way. So if everybody had that chance to be a resident steward and you knew what you were getting and you knew what you were giving. So in my world, resident stewardship means you give 20 hours a week. You get a, private locking room would be the goal. And you get Medicaid and you get SNAP, but you're giving 20 hours a week and you're contributing where you live.
I love this idea, but I would want to see it replace high school and not be resident. Just replace high school with community with jobs like this.
Sure.
And then have people having babies by about 20 years old. Get married and have your family by about 20, 22 years old. I feel like that prolonged adolescence, that period of time when you are not really responsible for yourself is so I know, I'm sorry, I'm derailing your proposal.
That want that option, that I think are being sucked in by this idea of socialism right now, which I think is really unfortunate. I love Bernie Sanders for many reasons, and that's, he was against the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which, he was right, and it ended up, and he was against the Iraq War. It ended up leading to the global financial collapse, and he was a leader in that way. But people are being drawn into this, to this idea that communism is a pathway, that there's this next level of stateless, classless, government-run society that's going to work. And I wish Papa Bernie would actually take accountability right now for the connection to DSA and how, Democratic Socialists of America have really taken things in this direction where they call it multi-tendency, which sounds really benign, but that just means that there are people who believe in, political revolution, armed revolution, and democracy as a goal towards that. And the founder of DSA was against communism and said it was anti-democratic. But in 2016 and beyond, there's been this whole push towards, wouldn't it be great if everything was taken care of for us? And I'm speaking to that, but in a structured way, where it's like taking things that already exist. There are resident steward programs all over. Like I've lived and worked in farms. I lived and worked in that place in the Berkshires. So I've lived that lifestyle of contributing and then getting room and board. There are a lot of people that would work for, but it would especially work for structuring these places for people who need our support to have a place to belong, to create that interdependence where they're giving and they're getting. And one of the reasons I'm doing this project right now in the city of Santa Fe, I'm working at 4 different sites, supported housing and also transitional shelter sites. And they're changing, the conservatives got their way in that, saying that we don't want to just give people benefits. People who are able-bodied adults under the age of 65 should have to contribute 20 hours a week. And I was already moving towards that before that was a requirement, because it turns out just getting things taken care of for you and not being part of things isn't good for your well-being. It's not good to just receive and sit around your apartment all day. There's loneliness epidemics. There's challenges in so many ways about that. So here we have this opportunity to turn a crisis, which is, in New Mexico alone, 90,000 people will be kicked off Medicaid at the end of next year if they don't work 20 hours a week. So that's 90,000 people in the state of New Mexico. Think about in each state, how many people are going to lose their Medicaid. And I'm saying, well, instead of states trying to backfill and get out of this requirement, what if we invested in resident steward programs that supported housing and shelter and these cabin villages and such, so that people were contributing, that they were actually giving back and having it be structured. So instead of backfilling, we're investing more. But here's what happens, Leslie. It takes a lot of work to do those programs to help people work.
I was just thinking it would create a whole new bureaucracy.
It creates a whole new bureaucracy. But I think we do need that option for the United States, that people have the option to live that interdependent resident steward lifestyle, but it takes a lot of work. And so like right now, I'm working at 4 different sites with 15 different people. And there are people who will lose their Medicaid next year who they won't be able to get a job. So what happens when they lose their health benefit? So you see how the left, historically has been saying, okay, well, if we don't provide Medicaid for this person, when they get into a accident or they have this larger health issue, then we have to foot the bill. And so we need to create this system to support people. And I'm saying, yes, you do, because at the end of the day, we're going to have to foot the bill if we don't support them, but there should be something that they have to contribute. But that does create a whole nother bureaucracy, because I'm trying to create it right now. I'm doing this pilot where I'm trying to think about, how do we support these people not losing their Medicaid and SNAP? And then also I'm I'm positing it as a training program. And so they're learning behavioral health, trauma informed care, conflict resolution, dealing with neighbors, dealing with PTSD, as well as doing tasks around where they live to support it. So that's my direction. I think we need to create a whole new bureaucracy based off of that, like maybe like a blend of AmeriCorps and resident stewardship to give people that option.
Hmm.
But that could all, like, I think about it and I think, oh my gosh, what if like 10 years from now, someone took the program that we lovingly created for 20 hours a week and this structure and they tightened the screws a little bit and then it felt like a prison.
Yeah.
And so I'm seeing ahead,
Yeah.
like I'm trying to
Yeah.
think ahead.
Bureaucracy is a scary thing too. I mean,
Right.
I think it's a big problem in a lot of ways, but I like what you're thinking about. I think it's really interesting. So using the PDA analogy, I think that one of the things that's harmful about that isn't that, oh, that kid's getting away with everything. It's that the kid's not developing. The kid's not learning the skills that he or she is going to need. It's giving up on that person and saying, you're not capable, so I give up on teaching you. And I think that there's that um, compassion that doesn't have that person's that's short term, that's about alleviating immediate issues, is not in that individual's in the compassion object's best interest. And I thought about this morning. I was looking at Twitter and I saw a video that was really, it was so charming. I wish it had gone on for much, much longer than it did. And it was a guy, and I think he's Australian because he had, just because of his accent, and he's running along the beach and he runs up. There's this flock of seagulls that's all over the ground and he chases them off. And there are a bunch of baby turtles emerging. And so that's what the seagulls were there to feed on the turtles. And he is there with a woman and he says, okay, so we're going to escort these guys to the water, but it's very important that we don't touch them. If you try to pick them up and carry them there, this is important for their development, that they make it to the water by themselves. And it's pretty far, so my first thought was scoop them up and take them to the water so they get there safely. And he says, no, you have to let them do it themselves. But so there's a way in which they're still recognizing that this creature needs to do this hard thing, and it's really hard. And if we walk away, a lot of them won't make it because the predators will swoop down upon them. But if we stand by and we allow them to do it for themselves and we're just keeping the predators off, they gain the skills. So I wonder if there's some way to look at this from that standpoint. Like, we have all these predatory elements in our culture right now, but people really do benefit from learning for themselves how to take care of themselves and how to find purpose and meaning. And so I wonder if there's something in that analogy. As we're talking, I'm just thinking about how, I had so much stress and so many times when my life was really, I didn't know how I was going to go from point A to point B.
Mhm.
And I think that was important for me to go through. And I think that most of us can probably call back to some story. You've talked a little bit about depression and the struggles there, and I'm sure that's an entire other story that is really meaningful and rich in your life. But I just wondered, this idea of the turtles need to get to the water, but it's not ultimately compassionate to pick them up and put them in the water.
Mhm.
And anyway, it's kind of like an unfinished analogy right there that I'm thinking about as we're talking.
Yeah. You know, I've been doing all these interviews with people, and I actually went to San Francisco, the Bay Area in July and led a team in doing like 600 interviews with people on the street. And I've been doing these interviews at supported housing and transitional shelter. And the thing is, every single person, when you're sitting across from them and hearing their story, it's just so clear to me that they have worth and value.
Hmm.
And then I also see that each person has this gnarly set of knots that it, and this happened at Ojai Tent Town too when I was living there. It's like you feel like, okay, well, let's untangle this knot, and then there's a huge one after that, and a huge one, and it feels like we're just treading water, almost trying to deal with the situation. And the situation is, how do they have a safe place to be and have their needs met? And
Mhm.
so I just keep coming back to that I want to create enough places that have structure for people to be, and have this like chutes and ladder system where if you're being harmful to your neighbors, then you go down into like a zone where you have less freedoms and you have more structure, and like, you have less ability to have guests over, because when you're running a tent town, you want to give everybody the ability to have guests, come over and spend the night. But then you're dealing with drug sales and potentially sex work and some unsavory characters. And then so you have to limit the freedoms. But there are half of the people there that if they just had a safe place to be, they wouldn't have any issues. Their issues are the fellow residents who have issues, if that makes sense. Like once they get stabilized. So there's within the groups, there's the people who could make it if they just had the support and the structure. And then there are the people that their challenges are just going to keep continuing because they have those challenges. But I just feel like everyone needs that space. And then I do feel like we should expect things of people, and have that accountability piece instead of just saying, we're going to cater to your needs because you've had a hard life. If you cater to someone's needs because they've had a hard life,
That'll be
that's not going to
everybody.
help them.
That's everybody's
but
life.
that's not going to help them
Yeah.
either,
Mm-mm.
because there needs to be that self-awareness and that contribution and that purpose. So I feel like to solve a problem, we have to invest very heavily. And if we're talking about make America great again, and we have this money available, I would love to see the creation of this resident stewardship program and enough spaces so that we could do what you're talking about, which is we could say we're going to have stricter rules about what's allowed in public, but before we can do that, I feel like we need to invest in creating the spaces for people to be, and then give them that connection of both like daily purpose of what they're doing, but also, just that human quality of like, you're a person that matters, and I'm still going to hold you accountable. I feel like for some reason, the left has a real problem with that because they just want to lift people up without holding them accountable.
It's falling in love with one side of a narrative.
Yeah.
And kind of having tunnel vision around that, not seeing, and just as you're talking, I was thinking to extend the metaphor of the seagulls, really, and the turtles. Maybe they're even doing a disservice to the development of those turtles by removing the predators, because maybe a part of what they need to learn on their way to the water is that there are dangers in life that they need to experience that fear and that adrenaline in order to dodge predators out at sea. So maybe there's even so not everybody succeeds. And maybe that's a part of what feels like an intolerably uncompassionate thing to say, that some people will just not make it. But maybe
what does that
that's
mean though? That
I don't know.
Make it
I don't know. Maybe it means that they fall into crime and that they do end up in prison. Maybe it means that their drug use ends up killing them. I don't know what it means. I don't really know, but I'm sort of thinking out loud, and I'm mindful of time. I've taken more of your time than I said I would. Yeah.
Okay,
but yeah, but this is so interesting. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to hear this perspective from someone who works in this field, and to play with ideas with you and kind of bounce some of my own thoughts off of someone who's more knowledgeable about what this actually looks like on the ground. So we're going to have you on our live stream on this coming Monday, so we'll have a chance to talk some more.
Good.
And I'll probably defer to the other ladies because I've had plenty of time to sort of get my thoughts out with you. But thank you so much, Amy, for joining me and for this conversation and for the work that you're doing. Can you tell people where to find you online if they want to find you or give any
Yeah.
recommendations?
Yeah. So stfrancischallenge.org is the website, and that's all spelled out SAINT, francischallenge.org.
Awesome. Great. I'll put links in the description of this video, and I look forward to seeing you on Monday for the live stream. Thank you so much.
And remember, everybody's homework is to figure out your 10 values that you're living by, because I just think that's so foundational in the work we do. And especially with all this division today, like who do you want to be and what do you want to be accountable to in this world?
If you have your 10 values written out somewhere, I'd be happy to stick those in the video
Oh,
description too for
yeah.
people to read.
Yeah. That's on our
Awesome.
website, but I'll send you a
Okay.
special link for that.
Sweet. Thanks.
All right.
Awesome. Ames,
Thanks,
it was great to
Leslie.
talk with you.
Talk to you soon. Bye.